Good evening, students. I trust that you're well. I'm coming to you tonight from Asheville, North Carolina, Billy Graham's Cove. I'm at a retreat with Todd Starnes, a Fox News commentator, and a bunch of friends. We're hanging out here in the woods for kind of a camp for adults. We're having a good time listening to some inspirational singing and just getting together and learning more about studying God's Word and having some time of worship this weekend. But I wanted to come in and interject some things that will help you out this weekend as you look to write your first article and kind of play catch up. It has been a long week. I know you can kind of see those bags under my eyes, and I'm sure there's probably some under yours. This has been kind of a trend setting week, if you will, for journalists. We've had witness to a lot of things this week. I've seen quite a few elections in my time. My first election that I probably paid any attention to was the election of Ronald Reagan. I was actually at his inauguration in Washington, D.C. as a young sailor when I was 18 years old. Actually, I had just turned 19 along with my husband. I had just been married and just been assigned to Washington, D.C. So it was with a lot of interest that we together watched this election take place Tuesday night and pulled an all-nighter. Wasn't the first in the week, which was surprising for me, which may be why I'm so tired. Anyway, as far as for our class, a lot of people are calling it historic, never been so divisive. I'm not quite so sure. Most elections where you've got two political parties, just like ball games where you have two teams, are divisive. There's things said that candidates wish were not said. There's promises made that will never be kept. And so, in the entire scheme of things, I'm not sure that it was any worse than any other election in history. I am sure of one thing. I am sure that the news has changed. I'm absolutely sure that in this digital age, that whatever is said has a more lasting effect in some ways. We at least have a 24-hour news cycle that makes things more pronounced. It seems as if things are closer to us because we have reporting from all over the world and from all over the United States. We have quicker access to the news. We have quicker access to opinion. We have as many people as we want that we follow on Twitter, so we can tap into as many opinions as we want. We can tag things and look up tags and get as many opinions as we want on what's trending. And we can peruse Facebook and Instagram and all of those things to see who's saying what about what at any given time. So at times it can be overwhelming. And part of the reason for this retreat is to get away from it all for a little bit. But it's all very interesting, and especially as you launch into a class that studies journalism. It's very important that we discuss some of the things that will guide you as you begin to write and think about and ponder what is it that guides the mind of a journalist. And I do want to remind you, as we embark on this course, that I'm going to be teaching you with a perspective. I was reminded of that tonight, but I'm going to be teaching you with a perspective of a Christian journalist. I'm unapologetically Christian. Everything that I do in my life, I do for the glory of God. And so when I write, when I research, when I ask people questions, and even when I present a story, I'm doing it with an understanding that I have a deep conviction for the truth. I have a deep conviction to want to present people fairly. I want to get at the truth of any matter. I want to make sure that my ideas and my facts are documented, and I want to make sure that I minimize harm. That if I know that my words, that my stories, that my headlines are going to fuel some kind of anger that's out of control, or misdirected or unrighteous activity, that I want to be very careful in how I use my power as a journalist. So I want to tell you that it's a very important part of what I do, because I am an active journalist, but it's also hopefully some of what I can teach you that guides a journalist with very high ethical standards, something I believe is sorely lacking in some of our journalists out there today. And do I get mad? Sometimes I get steamed, but mostly I pray, because it grieves me, it hurts me. It actually makes me sad to see that so many in my profession, my chosen profession, sometimes I'm not sure take seriously, especially that last thing that I mentioned, and that is to minimize harm. Just because we know the truth sometimes, just because we have the ability and the influence to be able to write a story or tell people things on a broadcast, doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And that the timing is right, that will make sure that we can minimize harm. Um, in other words, okay, I'm just going to say it bluntly. Is it necessary always to bring up something that somebody said a long while ago, knowing that it's politically motivated, when you know it's going to be harmful to a number of people, if it's politically motivated and if the timing is way off? Then you have to look at the motivation of the reporter, and if they're reporting it appropriately, especially if they're using inflammatory language or images over and over and over. Is it going to hurt, or is it going to help? And if it's going to help, who is it going to help, and how is it going to help? Okay, so we get into that all the time. Okay, we're going to just jump in. Your assignment is going to be to write an article this week. So before you can do that, though, there's a lot of things that you need to pay attention to. An article for this class is not like something, unless you're already familiar with journalism, which some of you may be, but if you're not, it's not like anything you've probably ever done. It's not like an essay that you've written for a literature class. It's not like an essay or a paper that you've turned in for a history class, or even for a high school newspaper per se, unless you worked on a newspaper that was very journalistic. So what we do is we look at a foundation of theory from your Kovach book, um, and then we build on that. So some of the ethical things that I've been talking to you about, you'll have been looking at in your text in the first 4 chapters of Kovach. And then your Harrower book talks more about the practical applications of that, the steps you take to write an article, which is, a lot of the research can be very similar to the steps that you take to gather information, say for a history paper or a literature-based paper. But how you present that on paper, the size of the paragraphs, even how you introduce a quote even, will be radically different in writing a news story. And that is because you are trying to capture a reader's attention and keep that momentum going. It's like keeping a river flowing with no logs in between. You don't have a captive audience. It's not like you have a history professor reading your paper. When you write a newspaper article, you're wanting people to come back and come back and come back and keep reading. And so anything from your headline all the way through each paragraph of that article, and those paragraphs need to be short. We'll talk about that in a minute. You want to grab and hold their attention. So all the rules go out the window as far as every paragraph needs 5 sentences. Every paragraph needs a thesis statement or a topic sentence. Those are not the rules for journalism. Journalism is different. You craft it differently. It would be like saying that all baked goods are equal. A cake is the same as a pie, or a cake is the same as a cookie. No. An article, a news article, journalistically written article, is going to be radically different than a paper, a 5-part essay, or a 4-page paper. That's going to be written differently than a newspaper article. Okay, so let's get to those foundational things I was talking about a second ago. Let me pull up my notes here. I am in a very nice room, in a very nice suite at the Cove, but I have a few little challenges and then I don't have all of my screens in front of me. So I'll try to make do with what I have here. In one of the chapters in Kovach, the authors talked about who journalists write for. Of course you write for your audience. The thing is, you write for them. You write in order to educate your audience. If you work at say the USA Today, you're writing for a broad spectrum of people. If you write for Mechanics Monthly, you're writing for mechanics. So you're going to find things that are of interest to those mechanics. If you write for the LA Times, you're going to be writing for people primarily in the LA County area. So you're going to always think about the people that you're writing for. Now, does that mean you cater to those people and you write about only things that they like? No. What it does mean is, though, that you do consider your audience, but you also consider what you think they might need as far as how to educate them as to what is going on in the world or in their community, and how you can bring that news to them. If you're writing for Mechanics Magazine or for 17 Magazine, for instance, or well, I'm speaking magazines now, I should be talking newspapers. I just taught a magazine course. If you're writing for the LA Times or the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, or for Christian Examiner, the newspaper that I edit, does that mean you specifically only have to write things that you think are for either that geographic area or that demographic of people? No, but you do think of your overall demographic or geographic or specific niche when you're writing those articles or when you're choosing your topics. You don't pick something that is so unrelated that it's not going to capture the interest of your reader. You're also, you're not writing for the advertisers or the governments. Sometimes advertisers, publishers, governments who produce those papers can use influence and coercion to try to get you to advocate their particular point of view. That's typically more in the line of public relations, and there's nothing wrong with public relations writing. And some of you may be public relations majors and you're learning how to write news articles and news writing style and so forth, which is very good. But those are going to be more advocacy type of articles. When you write news stories, particularly news styles of writing, you're going to be looking at more objective type of writing. You're not going to be interjecting a bias in it, and you're not going to be influenced by those whom you write for. Just recently, I discovered a gentleman that had written a bunch of editorials for, or opinion pieces for a special niche publication, was on that board, but he never disclosed it. And so it made me think it made me wonder whether he was using his influence as a board member to get those things published. And those things that he published were all very strong political pieces advocating a particular candidate for this presidential election. So it really sounded kind of shaky. And that's what I mean. You need to stay away from an appearance that you're giving into a publisher, an advertiser, a board member of those publications when you're writing. It's imperative that you stay away from having an appearance that you're catering towards the person who is paying the bills. Um, Journalism depends on those who do that. Journalists look towards minimizing harm, and I just gave you an example of that, so we'll skip right over that. That's in your text. For journalists can pay, and sorry if I stray a little, it's late, journalists can pay the ultimate sacrifice for doing their job, for getting the truth out, for being objective, for being fair. And they have. Journalists have paid great prices. They've lost their jobs. They've lost their lives, for example, in the Middle East. But that's sort of a, occupational, well, I don't want to scare you. What I do want to say is that journalists who take their craft seriously and their integrity seriously have sometimes put themselves right there on the line and been unwilling to flinch when it comes to fair reporting and insisting on being fair and not catering to one side or another. The journalism of verification is something that your text talks about, the Kovach text. If your work is verified and you've gone the extra mile to see whether it's factual or true, whether it's checked out, you're going to benefit. It is very difficult in this day and age to get to the bottom of things sometimes. You'll see something that's tweeted out there, or you'll see something on Facebook. You have to remember that just because somebody says it, just because it's published somewhere, does not mean that it's true. There is a great example in this election of a great untruth that was spread that it could have made the difference. Well, it did. There are people that are now reporting it. And I'm thinking about a story that I just read, and I want to pull it up without getting in your way here, which means my eyes will look like they're going everywhere, but they're really just going all over my screen. I wonder if you remember reading just within the last few weeks that in the New York Times and in the Washington Post, it was reported that evangelicals were not going to be voting for Donald Trump, that evangelicals were made up a large part of the Never Trump vote, that these were people that had held out and would never be voting for Trump. Well, as it turned out, as statistics will show, at least it is anticipated that the 25% of voters that helped Trump over the hump, per se, were evangelical voters. Now, that is statistically borne out. I am looking at an article that is yet to be published. It may be up tonight by a friend who sent it to me a little bit earlier. It's published in a newspaper that one of my colleagues works at. He said, here's part of the article. It says, the New York Times ran a headline October 17th, only 3 weeks from the election, claiming Donald Trump reveals evangelical rifts that could shape politics for years. It claimed that Trump was underperforming among evangelicals, garnering as little as 65% of the vote. Well, here's the deal. There was little in the article to verify that, to prove that. They quoted a couple of evangelical leaders that basically said that they were behind a Never Trump movement and that evangelicals just were not going to show up at the polls to vote for Trump. Well, the next thing that this article quotes is Lifeway Research, a division of Southern Baptist Convention's Lifeway Christian Resources, ran a headline. 2016 election exposes evangelical divide, claiming only 45% of Americans with evangelical beliefs would be voting for Trump, and that 31% were throwing their support behind Clinton. Now, how is it that just 3 weeks out from the election, these kinds of headlines were percolating up? Christianity Today ran a similar story. Washington Post ran a similar story. And all of a sudden, people were saying, wait a minute, evangelicals are not voting for Trump, which means they're either going to not vote, they're going to write in a third party vote, or they're going to vote for Hillary. So they're going to go, basically, evangelicals are not going to be voting pro-life. And so what happened? What did we see that happened? That did not happen. That was an untruth. And where did that information come from? Well, it's really not quite clear. It came from a few people who may have wished that that would have happened. And one can only wonder and ask, was that an attempt to try to influence the election? We're talking 25% of the voters who ultimately voted for Trump. So what was going on with these publications, with New York Times, with Washington Post, some of the biggest papers in the nation? Was it an attempt to, okay, I'm an evangelical, and other evangelicals aren't voting for Trump, so maybe I shouldn't vote for Trump? What was going on? Very important that you verify the information. I remember reading that and thinking, there's no proof, there's no verification. I didn't repeat the information, but I wondered how other people out there, how other newspapers and magazines all over the place were picking up and repeating that information. It's bizarre. I remember, I think at least one student told me within this past week that they believed that the New York Times was a good source of information. Students, think. New York Times, there is not one, I have never heard anyone say that the New York Times is a solid source of information, that on every issue, on every article that they have gotten it right. You can't trust one source. You cannot trust one source. Always use multiple sources, and that includes multiple articles in different papers, or multiple, not even just newspaper articles, but other means. Use surveys, use statistics, use magazine articles, use interviews with people, studies. Don't use just one source for anything. Okay, so there's in your inside reporting book, we're going to shift gears for a minute. Part of what you'll be doing this week, and I'm going to speed it up. It's already 23 minutes into this, and I didn't want to make this a long, drawn-out video. In your inside reporting book, there's a very good example, and I won't go over it, but it's on page 22. There's a comic book strip on how a story is developed. It's a very good demonstration on how a story is developed, all the steps of how a story is developed. Read that for yourself. Make sure, I mean, that's your assigned reading anyway, but make sure you check that out and how to develop your story. Now, I'm going to tell you, and then pages 24 to 25, how that story flows through the newsroom. I will say one of the differences in how a story flows through the newsroom is also the size of your newsroom. If you don't have a very large newsroom and your paper's rather small, you may be the person that writes the story, edits the story, publishes the story online, takes the pictures, publishes the pictures online, and puts together the whole package, and does the social media related to promoting the story. So just be aware that oftentimes in textbooks, there's going to be an assumption or a presumption that you have a large newsroom staff. So you may be the person that's the kind of the jack of all trades if you're in a smaller newsroom. Okay, the progression of a story, because I think it really helps when you can get your mind around how a real story comes about. Here it is, Tuesday night. it is late. I am watching the election and I'm tweeting. I'm tweeting. I'm trying to keep up, trying to get some tweets out there, seeing what other people are saying, um, and basically just, generally trying to keep myself awake as well and seeing what other people are saying. And then I start seeing an interesting trend, and that is some pastors from Florida. Florida is that, and everybody's eyes are on Florida. They're trying to see, the Florida returns had not come in yet fully. And Florida's a state that everybody was watching, a lot of electoral votes, a swing state. So, and I live in Florida. So I'm watching Florida intently, and I start seeing some activity from some Florida pastors on how, they're really praying, and they're really concerned about pro-life issues. And I'm like, I know this pastor. That's interesting. Oh, he's been really active. Well, that's interesting. I thought evangelicals were going to kind of sit on the fence. Well, then I know that my pastor in Jacksonville has not sat on the fence, and Jacksonville has one of the earlier returns posted in North Florida because we're in the Eastern time zone, and we're like it's going overwhelmingly to Trump. And I thought, the pastors here must have made a big difference. And so I thought, I'm going to start looking at the pastors in the other parts of the state. Well, I start looking at this pastor in the Tampa area, and he's been like out there pro-life, encouraging his people to vote, not who for, but to vote for a particular platform, a conservative platform that is a pro-life platform. And there was really only one pro-life candidate. So he's encouraging, he had been doing this for weeks leading up to the election. And I know that he's done that in previous elections. So I thought, okay, well, he didn't sit on the fence. Well, then I see another one that's, that one is in Brandon, and then one is south of Tampa in South Biscayne. And I know both of these gentlemen are in churches that are larger than 3,000. So I thought, this is interesting. That might make an interesting story. That seemingly against what the media has been saying, these pastors had no problem voting for Trump, or at least encouraging their people to vote a pro-life platform. If not for Trump, at least it's for a pro-life platform. And I wonder, that's just kind of interesting. And so in the midst of that, or I would ask them the question, is that what happened? What happened? Or at what point did you think that that was okay? Or were you surprised because evangelical leaders were kind of leading in this other direction, but you didn't do that. You led in this direction, and you encouraged your congregants to vote for a pro-life platform, although everyone was saying that the evangelicals were going to vote, either not vote at all, okay, vote for a third party, or vote for Hillary. So I DM'd one of them through Twitter, direct messaged them, and said, hey, Brother Cross, Dr. John, whatever I called him in particular, he's about my age. And I said, can I interview you in the morning? Well, remember, this was earlier. The time Florida was decided, this was earlier. And so he said, yeah, sure. I said, make it a little bit later, 9 o'clock. Well, as it turned out, 9 o'clock wasn't late. But we set up an interview for 9 o'clock in the morning. Then I DM'd another gentleman, the one from Brandon, Stephen Rummage, and he never did get back to me on Tuesday night. He got back to me Wednesday morning, kind of in the middle of my interviewing John Cross. So that's how it happens. But this is how you set up something like this. You get an idea. You act on the idea. Can I interview you? I started thinking of the questions, putting together some of the questions that I would ask, even though by this time it was after midnight and I could hardly think. Okay, so fast forward. Go to bed at 4 a.m. I don't know how I woke up, oh, I know how I woke up at 8 a.m. My son called me at 8 a.m. He's like, hey, Mom, I'm taking the kids to school. What about the election? And I'm like, it's okay. Oh, I'm glad. I'm glad you called. I'm glad you called. He's like, oh, I woke you up. I'm so sorry. And I'm like, no, 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 no. I'm glad you called because I've got an interview. And so I've got to get up and get ready. So I get up and, I get everything ready and kind of stumble over to my desk, and I get my iPad set up with my recorder and get my cell phone ready, make sure that everything's charged and plugged in, and get ready to go and start looking at some tweets and stuff. And I'm like, oh my goodness, all heck's broken loose since last night. Now we've got riots happening, and we've got this and that and whatever. And some terrible Twitter stuff going on. But nonetheless, I get everything ready and, finally connect with Dr. Cross. I think it was like 45 minutes after our appointed time because I was a little late. He was a little late. I was a little late. Okay, so we get on the phone and I'm recording him, but I'm also typing live. Okay, put it on speakerphone so I can type live because I can type a lot faster, definitely, than I can write. Okay, but I'm recording so that I can have some accuracy in case I don't get some of his things exactly right. That's one reason I'm recording. Here's the second reason I'm recording. People sometimes can forget what they say, or they're not careful about what they say. That's number 3. If you ask them, in most states, I'm not sure what California is, but check your state. Most states are two-party states. That means I have to give permission, duh, if I'm doing it, and he has to give permission, 2 parties. So the very first thing I asked him was, after we got done with a little chit-chat, was, do you mind if I tape you for accuracy? Now, what that means is I can't take that tape and go put it on a podcast somewhere. That's not what I asked to tape him for, because frankly, I don't want to. But I asked him if I could tape him for accuracy. That means I can go back through and listen. Okay, and of course he agreed. So while we're doing that, I'm taping him, I'm asking him questions about the election. When did he think of, did he ever have a hesitancy at all about Donald Trump? And he said no, he was going to vote pro-life. Even when that awful thing happened with that, the comments that he made that were revealed, that he said no, that was terrible, but that the man apologized, but still he wasn't voting for the man's character. He made a lot of comments. He also made a lot of comments about the leadership that were encouraging evangelicals to not vote, but that didn't represent him, and so forth. So, interviewed him, and during the interview, I literally got that DM from the other pastor. So, got off the phone with him, interviewed the other pastor, started working on the story. The story took me a lot longer. I went into the next day, even went into Thursday with the story, and it wasn't until late Thursday night that I had one of my other writers/editors look at it. Always good to have a second person look at that story, and then finally posted it. Oh, let me back up. I really fast forwarded what happened between the time I interviewed him and the time I wrote the story. So I did the interview, so I had these 2 Word documents, each separate Word document with my interview notes, and I had both of them taped, 2 separate tapes. But then I thought about it for a while. It's an important story. So I thought for a while, and I kept thinking, what's my lead going to be? What's my lead going to be? Excuse me. I think my lead was something like, he said something about how we may not be in the moral majority, but the evangelical leaders need to take us seriously. In other words, he felt like they had been somewhat bullied by the evangelical leaders who wanted them to vote a certain way, or wanted them to encourage their congregants to vote a certain way. It's like he felt like a small group of leaders was out there saying, evangelicals, which there are a lot of in this country, you need to vote a certain way because we feel like the character of Donald Trump is terrible, which most people would agree, but that there's no redeeming him. But that is more important than the fact that he is pro life. At least he says he's going to represent pro life people. And the other candidate said that she would not represent pro life people. That's kind of loosely put out there. So he's kind of like weighing the two. And he said, you know, in other words, he gave his explanation. So whether you agree with it, whether you don't agree with it, the man is giving his explanation. Now, here's what's really important as a writer. It is not your purview to make up your mind whether you agree or disagree with these people. Whether you agree that you can't be a single platform voter, or you can't be a single issue voter and you have no respect for them. You can ask them that question. Absolutely. It's how you ask, and whether you're trying to intend to get a particular answer. That would be a leading question and not appropriate. Are you asking them because you're genuinely interested? You need this information for your story? Are you offended and that's why you're asking particular questions? Are you playing devil's advocate? That's okay. There's a lot of good reasons why you ask good questions, even when you don't agree with people or when you agree with people, to maintain your objectivity and to help your story maintain its objectivity. I absolutely asked Dr. Cross, well, did you have, or your three daughters or wife, have a problem with Donald Trump's comments, or I may have rephrased that differently. I may have said, did the comments that he made that were broadcasted that were very vulgar, did you ever hesitate because of those comments? And he gave me his answer. Uh, Not at all. He didn't get defensive. He knew that that's part of my job, is to answer or to ask those questions. So those are the kinds of things that you're going to ask. The better the questions, the better your story. You cannot write a good story without a good interview. If it's an interview based story, you cannot write, can I say that again? You cannot write a good story without a good interview. And you cannot have a good interview without good questions. Now, does this mean that you have to sit there ahead of time and go, okay, I'm just going to really labor over this. I'm going to slave over this. No, what it does mean is realize your own limitations. You need to be as prepared as you need to be. If you're a very natural, curious, conversationalist type person, you may do more off the cuff. I'm not suggesting that at all. You do need to be prepared. You need to write out some things ahead of time. Does that mean you have to write, if you're going to ask them 20 questions, you have to write out all 20? No. you can do some overall questions that will lead you to follow-up questions, but don't be afraid to ask follow-up questions. Don't be afraid to write a question down on your pad, on your piece of paper, while you're talking to them, that you'll come back to. Now, also remember, if you're interviewing somebody, kind of like I'm doing right now, you do not want to stop and have to write things down on a piece of paper and have them slow down. If you're interviewing somebody with more than 2 or 3 questions. Okay, if it's 2 or 3 questions and you're just getting a quick response to something, you just want an answer to 1 or 2 things, okay, or maybe 3. You can write those answers down quickly, okay, and you can ask them to slow down. But if you're having an interview with them, if you've set up a 15-minute interview, a 20-minute interview, half an hour, then no, you need to have a tape recorder running. You can write down some observations or some notes. But basically, then you put your notebook down, or you just kind of lay things down for a second. You have a conversation and you let the tape run. And then you go back and you do the hard work of a real journalist and you do what's called transcribing that interview. That is, unless you're very proficient at your laptop and you feel comfortable enough in taking your laptop into that interview and actually sitting there and typing during your interview. And you can face them, you can still look at them. I do that. I absolutely do that. I'll grab my laptop, go in and sit with somebody, depending on who they are. Now, I wouldn't do that if it was a, a senator or something like that, but there's plenty of people that I do that with. And actually, I've done that with senators, so I don't know why I'm saying that. But it depending on who it is, I will absolutely take my laptop because I can look them straight in the face and still take notes on my laptop. And I have my tape recorder backing me up. Always have my tape recorder backing me up. It's a matter of credibility. Okay, I've gone on way long. It's 40 minutes. The crafting the story part, think, pray, think. When you look back over your notes, what is going to be something that will interest people about the subject. Don't go chronological. Don't think you have to go according to your notes or according to the questions you asked. Think interesting. Interesting. That question about being in the moral majority. I didn't just start out with John Cross wanted to vote wanted his congregants to vote pro-life, and so blah blah blah. And think interesting, and then keep a good example is the best teacher. The reason you're reviewing so many articles this term is so that you read good news articles. So look at a good news article. Look at one that you think is really well written that kept you going all the way through, and use it as an example. Look, it's a paragraph, and then it's a quote, and then it's another paragraph or two of transition, then there's another quote. Follow that model. At least the first couple of times that you write, follow the model, and then make it work for you a little bit. It's kind of like when you cook, you follow a recipe. So pick a model and find a model and make it work. And really, that's how it works. Study how a really good article is written, and it's a comparable article with maybe two different people that are being interviewed, and look at it, study it. Good example is the best teacher. Okay, that's all for now, and it's about 45 minutes, about 42 minutes. And give me a call, email, text if you have any difficulties writing that article. I really want it to be a good article. Base it on an event that you go to, a person that you hear lecture, or something like that. And I know we didn't say to base this one, I don't believe, on an interview, but if you do, that's fine too. So have a great weekend. Blessings. Bye.